Hey, it's Phantom of Darkness here. I have a really important question for you. Have you ever been attacked by Bigfoot? Yeah, me either. I don't think that's realistic. But these stories that I'm about to share with you are campfire exquisite stories. They're stories that, while they may be a little bit on the edge of sanity, could be real. You never know. So why don't you drop a like, a comment, and let me know you're active on this channel. I'm Phantom of Darkness, and I don't know who else would be, besides me, obviously. So leave a like, comment, share, and let's begin with the stories. I've always been drawn to the wild, to places where nature still whispers secrets of the past. A few years ago, I decided to take a solo camping trip deep in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, near the Cades Cove area in Tennessee. It was early November, and the air had that crisp, biting chill that both invigorates and unnerves you. I'd heard the old legends, stories of strange sounds in the night, of ghostly apparitions drifting among the trees, but I chalked them up to folklore. I didn't expect the mountains to make me question everything I thought I knew. I arrived in the late afternoon, after a long drive from Knoxville, and found a small secluded clearing along the banks of a narrow tributary of the Little River. The trees were ancient, their gnarled branches twisted in the shapes that suggested silent watching figures. I pitched my tent, set up a modest campfire, and prepped for a night under a star-smeared sky. Everything felt normal enough, if not a little bit too still. That first night was eerily quiet. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of the leaves and the distant call of an owl. I sat by the fire, warming my hands and readying a dog-eared copy of a mystery novel. But as the clock neared midnight, I started to notice things that didn't quite belong. At first, it was the feeling of being watched. I'd glance up from my book only to catch movement in the periphery of my vision. A shadow that darted behind a tree, or a flicker of light between the trunks. I told myself it was just my imagination running wild in the dark. The combination of isolation and exhaustion playing tricks on my mind. Then came the whispers. I couldn't make out distinct words, but there was a murmur in the wind, a soft, almost pleading sound that seemed to echo from somewhere deep in the forest. I tried to convince myself it was just the rustling of the leaves, but it had a rhythm, a cadence that felt deliberate. I extinguished my campfire, not wanting to invite any unwanted attention, and crawled into my tent, hoping sleep would come. Around 2:30 a.m., a sharp noise, a snap of a twig, jolted me awake. My heart was pounding as I lay in darkness, straining to hear. Then, over the low hum of the forest, I distinctly heard footsteps approaching my tent. They were slow and measured, crunching on fallen leaves. I wanted to call out, to ask who was there, but my throat felt paralyzed. I listened as the sound circled the tent for what felt like an eternity, before slowly fading away. I finally drifted into a fitful sleep, only to be roused by a persistent knocking sound right at the edge of my tent flap. I unzipped the tent, expecting perhaps a curious animal, but instead, I was met with the inky blackness of the woods. No eyes gleamed back, no shape moved, only an impressive silence that followed the echo of that soft, deliberate rap. Unable to shake my unease, I decided to venture out a little after sunrise. Dusk would be over soon, and I needed to find some rational explanation for what had transpired. I packed a small backpack with essentials, water, a flashlight, my phone, and left the relative safety of my tent. The forest was gradually waking up with the morning mist still clinging to the undergrowth. I followed a barely visible path that hoped would lead me back towards the main road. That's when I stumbled upon something odd. A dilapidated cabin, partially hidden by overgrown ferns and moss. I hadn't seen any of it on the maps, and its presence in this remote location of the Smokies was startling. The wooden structure looked abandoned, its door hanging slightly ajar. The air around it felt heavy, as if burdened by decades of secrets. Drawn by equal parts curiosity and dread, I approached slowly. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a dark interior. Dust motes danced in the weak beams of sunlight that filtered through broken windows. Inside, I found a few scattered belongings, a rusted lantern, a bundle of yellow letters tied with frayed twine, and an old photograph of a family that looked like they'd lived in the cabin 100 years ago. The faces in the photo were somber, almost resigned. On the back, I could just make out a date, 1892. As I held the photo, a chill ran down my spine. I suddenly remembered the whisper from the night before. Had they been trying to tell me something? My mind raced with questions, and I realized that this cabin might be connected to the legends of the local area. Stories of a family that vanished mysteriously, leaving behind nothing but sorrowful echoes and unanswered questions. I left the cabin quickly, unable to shake the feeling that I was trespassing on a place that wasn't meant for the living. The forest now seemed to close in around me, the trees whispering secrets in a language older than me. I hurried back towards my campsite, but the path that I had taken earlier was nowhere to be seen. Instead, I found myself on an unfamiliar trail, lined with ancient oaks and maples whose leaves whispered underfoot like anxious voices. By mid-afternoon, I finally emerged onto a familiar dirt road. I flagged down a passing car, explaining my situation in a halting voice. The driver, an older man with kind eyes, listened intently and told me that many hikers and campers had reported strange happenings in that part of the park over the last few months. Disappearances, ghostly figures seen out of the corner of one's eye, and an overwhelming sense of dread near the old cabin. I wasn't sure how much of it was a local legend, but the driver's earnestness left little room for doubt. Even now, as I write this from the safety of my apartment in Knoxville, I can still feel the lingering chill of that night. I've since tried to rationalize everything, blaming sleep deprivation, the isolation, and my own overactive imagination. But every time I drive past the entrance to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, or see an old photograph of a weathered cabin, I'm reminded of that night, and the feeling that I wasn't alone in the dark. I sometimes wonder if that night was more than a series of unfortunate coincidences, a collision of natural sounds, and the eerie history of a forgotten place. Whether it was the restless spirit of the family that once lived in that cabin, or simply the sinister ambiance of a place where the past never truly dies, I can't say for sure. All I know is that the wilderness holds secrets that defy easy explanation, and sometimes, when you venture too deep into the unknown, you end up confronting something that changes you forever. That camping trip left me with more questions than answers, and resolved never to return to that part of the Smokies. The mountains are beautiful, but they have a way of reminding you that not all beauty is benign, and some places are best left undisturbed. I still wake up at night remembering the soft, almost pleading whispers in the dark, and I can't help but wonder, was I really alone under those ancient, watchful trees? I've always been drawn to the mysteries of the Pacific Northwest. The deep, ancient forests, the constant drizzle, the whisper of legends in the wind. About 2 years ago, I decided to take a solo camping trip deep in the North Cascades near the Saget River in Washington. I'd heard local tales of Bigfoot sightings in this area, and while I'd always been skeptical, I was curious enough to see for myself. I set out on a crisp October afternoon, my gear packed and my mind set on solitude and quiet reflection. I drove for hours along winding roads until I reached a remote trailhead near Concrete, Washington. From there, I hiked for nearly 2 hours into the wilderness, following a barely visible logging trail that meandered through towering hemlocks and Douglas firs. The forest was damp, the air thick with the ancient moss and earth. I finally found a small clearing behind a slow-moving stream, a perfect spot to pitch my tent. That first evening, the sun dipped behind the mountains, and a cool fog began to roll in. I built a modest campfire and sat quietly, enjoying the sounds of the forest. Crickets chirped, and the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush formed a natural lullaby. I had no idea that this was quiet solitude. It was merely a prelude to a night that would forever change my perception of reality. At around 11 p.m., as I was drifting off into a light sleep, I was abruptly awakened by a series of deep, resonant knocks on my tent. At first, I thought it might have been a bear or a large animal investigating my camp, but the sound was strangely measured, almost if someone or something was knocking deliberately. I unzipped a flap, a crack, and peered into the darkness. Nothing moved in the weak beam of my headlamp, except the dense, rolling fog. I returned to my sleeping bag, my heart thundering in my chest, and tried to convince myself it was the wind, or perhaps a branch tapping against the tent. But as I lay there, a heavy, unmistakable odor of wet earth and decaying leaves sipped in. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Around 2 a.m., I awoke again, this time to the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps circling my campsite. I sat up, gripping the zipper of my tent, and listened as the footsteps paused right outside. Then, in the oppressive silence, I heard a low guttural sound, almost like a distant growl mixed with a plea. I fumbled for my flashlight and shined it outside. In a jittery beam of light, I caught a glimpse of something large moving between the trees. It was hard to tell. A mass of dark, shaggy fur in a hulking frame, easily over 7 feet tall. The creature seemed to vanish as quickly as it appeared, swallowed up by the mist. The rest of the night passed in a haze of restless anxiety. When dawn finally broke, I emerged from my tent to a scene that made my blood run cold. Near the edge of the clearing were large muddy footprints, each nearly 16 inches long, with unmistakable stride that could only belong to something enormous. The prints led towards a dense stand of pines where the fog still clung stubbornly to the ground. I followed them for a short distance before they abruptly ended at a fallen log, half hidden by undergrowth. In the pale morning light, I tried to rationalize what I had seen. Was it really Bigfoot? Or was I simply tired, letting my imagination run wild in place where nature itself seemed to hold its secrets close? I gathered my gear and began my hike back towards the trailhead, my mind a world of conflicting emotions. But as I made my way along the narrow path, I couldn't shake the eerie feeling, the sensation of being followed. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that massive figure lumbering just out of sight. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. At one point, I paused behind a small brook and noticed a pair of dark, reflective eyes peering at me from behind a cluster of ferns. I froze. The eyes were gone in an instant, leaving only the memory of a piercing stare. Later that day, I reached a small ranger station near Missoula, Washington, and recounted my experience to an old park ranger. He listened intently before telling me about local legends, a tale of a solitary Bigfoot that roamed these parts, sometimes even described as a spectral presence. Some old-timers claimed it was not just an animal, but perhaps the ghost of a long-lost soul, a logger who perished in a tragic accident and now wandered these woods in search of redemption. I couldn't say what to believe. The rational part of me dismissed it as folklore, yet the evidence from that night gnawed at my uncertainty. That encounter changed the way I saw the wilderness. Every subsequent camping trip was haunted by memories of the night, the deliberate knocks on my tent, the weight of unseen eyes tracking my every move, the silent, deliberate footsteps in the fog. Even now, I sometimes wonder if that I encountered was a living creature, a tortured spirit, or perhaps a combination of the both. Something that defies easy explanation. I keep the large footprint pressed between the pages of my journal, a reminder that sometimes nature hides truths too mysterious for words. I'd always found winter camping in the Rockies to be a refreshing escape, until one cold January changed everything. I decided to head deep into Rocky Mountain National Park near Bear Lake, seeking solitude and the stark beauty of a snowy wilderness. The higher altitudes meant isolation, a pristine silence punctuated only by my own crunching footsteps and the distant call of a lone owl. I pitched my tent in a secluded clearing, confident that nature's harshness would be my only companion. That first night, the sky was a frozen tapestry of stars. I warmed my hands around a small campfire and sipped lukewarm coffee, feeling the gentle buzz of isolation. But as the wind picked up and the fire's light flickered against the dark silhouettes of towering pines, I began to feel an unsettling presence. At first, it was just a vague impression, a sensation that I wasn't entirely alone. I shrugged it off as the natural paranoia of a lone camper in winter. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the fresh, undisturbed snow, a few yards from my camp, I found a set of footprints. They were unmistakably human, deep and deliberate, with a stride that spoke both urgency and purpose. They led away from my sight, disappearing into a narrow trail carved between the trees. I rationalized that perhaps another camper had passed by, but the trail's isolation in the late hour made that explanation hard to swallow. A few hours later, just as I was drifting between sleep and wakefulness, I was jolted awake by a sharp, deliberate cracking of a branch right outside my tent. My heart hammered in silence as I lay frozen, listening to a slow, measured shuffle of footsteps in the snow. I unzipped the tent, flapped a fraction, and peered out into the darkness. For a moment, I caught a glimpse, a hulking shape moving just behind the tree, partially obscured by swirling snow and shadow. Then it was gone. Panic set in. I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that something or someone was stalking me. My instincts screamed that I wasn't merely witnessing a wanderer's tracks, but the deliberate approach of a man with deadly intent. The local diner in Estes Park had whispered rumors of a murder on the loose. A man whose trail of unsolved crimes had become the stuff of local legend. I'd never given those tales much credence, until now. Determined not to become a victim, I grabbed my backpack and fled into the biting night, heading towards a small ranger station that I knew was about half hour's hike away. The snow whipped against my face as I sprinted along a narrow trail, my breath coming out in ragged clouds. Every so often, I glanced over my shoulder and caught a fleeting glimpse of a dark figure, dressed in a heavy parka, his features obscured by the hood, keeping pace with me. The sound of heavy boots pounded relentlessly on the frozen ground behind me. I pushed my aching legs to keep moving, the icy air burning in my lungs. The wind roared in my ears, drowning out all the thoughts except one: escape. I finally burst into the ranger station, shivering uncontrollably, and gasped out my story to the on-duty ranger. His face turned ashen as he listened, and he immediately radioed for backup. The station's small heater did little to thaw the chill that had seeped into my bones. In the dim light of dawn, while the snow was still clung stubbornly to every surface, a search party combed the surrounding area. They found more footprints, parallel to mine, deeper and more erratic, leading into the forest's dark heart. But there was no sign of the man who pursued me. All that remained was the silence of the wilderness and an overwhelming sense that the danger hadn't fully processed. Over the following weeks, local news began reporting over strange incidents in the area. Hikers disappearing without a trace, vague sightings of a lone figure lurking in the shadow. Some even speculated, half-jokingly, that the murderer had become a spectral presence, a ghost doomed to wander the Rockies in an eternal cycle of violence. I couldn't decide if that notion was absurd or terrifyingly plausible. Every winter, the mountains revealed their secrets to brave or foolish enough to venture into their icy depths. Even now, as I sit by a window in the relative warmth of my home, I can still feel the cold echo of that chase. I remember the sound of heavy boots crunching in the snow, the horrifying realization that I'd been pursued by a killer who had lurked in the silence of a winter night. I'd never learned the true fate of that murderer, whether he was caught, or if he still prowls the shadowed trails of Rocky Mountain National Park. But the memory is a stark reminder that nature's beauty often hides a dark, unpredictable edge. Every time I see a snowfall, or hear a distant crunch on a winter trail, I wonder, is that just the wind? Or could it be the restless footsteps of a man, or something else, still hunting in the cold, unforgiving wilderness?